Let's look at the new Langeid sword from Windlass. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So here we're going to do a little review of the new Langeid sword, which has been in development, shall we say, for quite a long time from Windlass. So I've noticed online quite a few people talking about this. I had to sort of keep my mouth shut because I did know a bit about the development of this because I work with Windlass. And on that topic, so first up, this is going to be an honest review with some positive and some negative, okay? It's a completely honest review. This isn't a product that I developed with Windlass, okay? So I don't get anything out of this product. This is something that they were developing by themselves. I did give some feedback on earlier prototypes. I've actually got a couple down here. Just grab one of them here. There's an earlier prototype with the hilt was too long and things like that. So I did give some feedback, but nevertheless, I'm going to be completely honest because it would undermine my reviews if I wasn't completely honest about this. But nevertheless, this is the Langeid sword. Now, what is the Langeid sword? What is Langeid? So this is modelled on a sword that was found in Norway in the early 20th century. And in fact, when Peterson was making his typology of Viking era swords, this is a late Viking sword, when he was making his typology, he wasn't yet aware of this particular type. So this isn't actually included in Peterson's typology, but since then, a few other examples have been found. I think there's another one in Norway, there's one in Denmark, there's one in Finland, and there's, I think, a couple down in the Balkans. So there's various other ones of this sword. There you go, found around. Or I won't say of this, but of the same type. Now, the thing which characterises them is this very characteristic style of hilt, which, as I say, is late Viking era. So we're really talking about after 1000 AD or thereabouts. Okay, so we're talking about 11th century swords. So this would have been around, probably still being used at the time of the Battle of Hastings, but it would have been, you know, in this final stage of the Viking era, essentially. And one of the things that characterises them is they have iron pommel and cross of this shape that have applied semi-precious metals, so silver and gold, over the top, essentially. So they're kind of plated. And that's what this is. So this is an iron hilt which is plated, which is why it looks very shiny. Now, we have to bear in mind, to modern aesthetic and to modern eyes, some of you might think this looks like a fantasy sword, or it looks completely outlandish compared to what you're usually used to with Viking era swords. And I'd kind of agree with you. It takes a bit of getting used to, but the fact is that this is an important category of late Viking era swords. There are several of them around. And this is what they would have looked like, more or less, when they were new. They were bright and silver plated. Now, before I get into the nitty gritty of this review, first of all, I have to say two main things. First of all, the blade of this is essentially a generic Type 10 blade. And the original Langeid sword, the blade is extremely corroded. So we only know the loosest basic details about that blade, not necessarily all of the exact details of it. The second thing to say is that this is an impression of the Langeid sword. It is not a minute millimetre by millimetre replica, and there are some differences in the decoration. So once again, to reiterate, this is essentially a replica based on photographs and some vague measurements that were found online. And in fact, I did help a little bit. I did point Windlass to where to find more data in the museum in Norway. There's a whole bunch of photographs, and I think that's where they based pretty much most of the design. I did also point out that the surfaces on the underside of the guard and the pommel were decorated, and they kind of went away and did that. But as I say, this is something which I gave a few pointers to, also to do with the blade. We got rid of, there was a mid-rib up at the tip, which is a common flaw that people put on Viking era swords, which shouldn't be there. And so some little things like this. So I had a little bit of feedback into it because obviously I have a close working relationship with Windlass on the Royal Armouries line. But this, I can't, hand on heart, call this a close replica of the original in terms of measurements or anything like this, and I wasn't involved in that side of things. So there are some differences between this replica and the original, but that being said, there are not many people making replicas of either the Langeid sword or that type of sword. And I think this is a pretty good impression of one. I think there's one other replica of the Langeid sword on the market, and this is closer than that, and I think a better quality, better made sword. If you want a late Viking era sword, I think this is probably better than its direct rivals. So actually, let's look at the thing, the pluses and minuses, or whatever constructive feedback. I'm going to dispense with the scabbard as I always do in my reviews, although I will come back to that at the end. So let's just, you do get a scabbard with a belt, that's all included in the package, and also it comes in some rather nice packaging as well, which is something which Windlass, I think, put more effort into their packaging and presentation than a lot of other companies do, even some quite high-end companies. So actually, if you're giving this as a gift, like for Christmas or something, then this would be a nice sort of presentation thing. Right, so this is a late Viking era sword. The blades on lots of swords in this era, in this period, are fundamentally quite similar. They've got a broad, shallow fuller. They are broadsword blades that taper very slightly. Some taper more than others. In fact, by this period, some of them actually are starting to taper quite a bit. They have more or less spatulate tips, so obviously they can be used for thrusting, but that's not their primary purpose. And because of the broad shape of the tips, they're actually quite effective at cutting way out at the tip. So unlike a lot of later medieval swords like Type 14s, Type 15s, Type 18s, these Type 10s are still quite broad up here, which are much like a Japanese sword, for example, means that even if you chop right near the tip, although it's further up from the centre of percussion, which is down here, if you cut right up at the tip, you're still going to cut pretty effectively. So they are effective chopping tools. And their point of balance is not crazy far up the blade. As you can see here, they've got relatively heavy hilts, and that's true of a lot of Viking era swords. But nevertheless, because of the amount of width, shall we say, breadth of the blade at the tip, you feel a lot of blade presence. So you know that when you hit a target with this, it is going to have a lot of shearing and chopping potential. And obviously these are pretty much always in period used with shields, either with boss grip shields or kite shields in this period as well. So sometimes strapped kite shields, so a Norman type shield if you want to call it that, or a boss grip shield. Both of those would go perfectly with this. So, some taper to the blade. It does have distal taper. I haven't actually measured it, but I can clearly see it. I believe this starts about 6mm at the base of the blade and tapers down probably to about 3mm. You can see from the flex, it has good distal taper. So, I think some people are used to older Windlass models from, years ago, before I started working with them basically, that don't have any distal taper at all. This absolutely does have distal taper, and you can see it's completely stiff in the first half of the blade and flexes in the second half of the blade. Not only does that mean that the flex is in the second half of the blade, it also means that the mass distribution is more towards the hand, and it's not so sort of overweight at the tip. There are other, shall we say, budget Viking era sword replicas out there that will be 4 or 5mm thick here, 4 or 5mm thick here, 4 or 5mm thick here, and they handle like crowbars. They don't handle anything like original Viking era swords because they don't have any distal taper. So it's important with most, I won't say with all, because all is always a dangerous thing to say, but with most broad blades, you need to have good distal taper in order to have that nice, reasonable amount of responsiveness in the blade. And you can see that this thing moves fairly quickly. It's not light, but it's not heavy. It's actually kind of medium weight for a sword of this size. It's just under 1,300 grams. So I measured it, it's 1,295 grams, this particular example. Obviously, with any mass-produced things, there's going to be some variance up and down from there, but this one's 1,295, which is a completely typical weight for a Viking or a sword of this period. And it's a typical size, width, length, and everything else. Okay, you can check out the stats. Obviously, there's a link below to this product, so you can check out all of those things there. Now the hilt is the blade is fairly generic actually for this period, and you could slap that blade on just about any Viking era hilt and it would look perfectly normal and fine. It's a really good blade, and actually before I do move on to the hilt, I want to just mention that whatever you think about this style of hilt, it might not be your cup of tea, because I actually think it's quite a divisive style, particularly with the plating. I think, you'll either love, it's a bit, we would say in England, it's a bit like Marmite. You either love it or you hate it. Although having said that, I'm not sure whether I love it or I hate it. I don't think it's really my cup of tea. But nevertheless, it's very iconic style of hilt and an important subcategory of late Viking era swords. So if you've got a bunch of other Viking era swords, one of these would be good to have in the group anyway, to show kind of like where they ended up going. But anyway, back to the blade just for a second. This is a really good blade. So as I've shown if you haven't checked out yet, have a look at my video looking at the Windlass factory. So I spent some time in the spring out in India. I had a few days out there, brilliant time with the Windlass family and checking around all of the factory, looking at all of the production. You can check out that video in my playlist. And you will see there the lengths to which they go in the Windlass factory to make good quality blades. And this is, I think it's 1080 steel, and it's well heat treated. They are tested, and it's a really good blade. And honestly, this blade is as good as loads of other really high-end Viking era sword blades out there. And as I say, you could put this blade on all kinds of hilts, and it would be a really good sword. So as a functioning blade, the flex, the heat treatment, the hardness is really, really good. Now I have to say, hand on heart, this isn't a fully sharpened one. You can see I'm handling the blade. Now this is what I would call semi-sharp. So this is essentially a really thin edge that is ready for its final sharpen. It's not like a blunt reenactment sword or anything like that. This is about maybe 0.6 or 0.7 of a millimeter. So it is really ready for the final sort of edge bevel or apple seed edging to it. So this is the correct weight, the correct flex, taper, everything else. Great blade. Right, onto the hilt. So the hilt on these late Viking era swords, instead of being made up, for example, the pommels on migration era swords are often kind of like a sandwich, and different parts of the pommel are riveted to each other. These are more like later medieval swords in that you have a guard, a grip and a pommel, and then a peen at the end. And this is peened at the end, riveted in other words, through at the end. So this is a complete one-piece tang that is the same material as the blade, comes through to the end and is peened at the end. So it's a relatively simple construction, but that's different to how some earlier Viking era swords were constructed, where they were peened internally and then there was an extra pommel cap put on the end, and that pommel cap was riveted to the underneath bar, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this is more of a simple, like later medieval. And in many ways also, this is a junction, the Langeid sword and the swords associated with it is a junction point between Viking era, like typical Viking era swords, and later medieval swords in terms of its construction, its shape, its design, the proportions between the pommel and the guard. You'll see the guard is much longer and the pommel is kind of rounder. So this is more like medieval swords that come after the Viking era. Anyway, so we've got, as I say, iron or steel guard and pommel that are plated, and these are silver plated with gilded kind of highlights, and you'll see that there is decoration all over the surfaces of the guard, both sides, also on the underneath of the guard there, also on the pommel front and back, also on the underneath of the pommel in there. We'll come to the grip in a second. And that is based on the original Langeid sword, which is in the museum in Norway. Now, what I will say is I've pulled up the large resolution. So this is, I guess, a constructive critique. The decoration doesn't exactly match the original sword, but it's kind of close to it. So what I would describe it as is kind of like an impression of. So this has a number of letters around it. If we just look here on the pommel, for example, these are a number of letters. There's an E, there's an X, there's an S that it's thought to be, and various other things. Now, these are very, very interesting. There's also crosses in here, which are probably crucifixes. So there's much been debated around the design of this sword and the details on it, the sort of iconography, I guess you could call it, and the symbology. And it is widely thought that this is Christian, okay? So if you are interested in the history of Christianity on weapons, and obviously there's a lot of that when we get into the kind of like crusading era, this is one of the earliest examples from medieval Europe of that, especially from Scandinavia, because in Norway, of course, this is the period when Christianity was becoming widespread, or certainly spreading. but there was still a strong pagan Odinist tradition. So what's interesting is this was buried in a grave. The Langeid sword was buried in a pagan-ish grave with a great Dane axe, okay? So a large-headed, two-handed, probably two-handed axe. Obviously the shaft doesn't remain, but from the size of the axe head, you guess it was a two-handed axe. So the owner of this, you could imagine a bit like one of those housecarls from the Bayeux tapestry, a guy who would have worn a mail shirt and would have had a helmet, would have had a two-handed axe and a sword at their side. So this is the sort of sword that potentially could have been carried by one of Harold Hardrada's housecarls or one of Harold Godwinson's housecarls, who were themselves either of Danish or Anglo-Danish extraction, as Harold Godwinson himself was as well. He was part Danish. So absolutely, this is a sort of sword that could have been carried at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 by someone carrying a Dane axe. And it's even possible that the person this was buried with had been a housecarl. It's entirely possible. Anyway, so this sword contains both Christian symbolism, but it was buried in the pagan fashion. So it's a fascinating object, archaeological object, the Langeid sword, because it shows that junction in Scandinavia between Christianity and paganism. And itself as a sword, even just as a silhouette, is also like the junction between Viking era swords and later Christian era swords in Scandinavia. So it's a really, really important sword in its historical context. Right, okay, and now, but I really want to reiterate, so the decoration on here is close to the Langeid sword, but it's not the same as the Langeid sword. And there are certain things, certain letters and stuff which are slightly different to the original. And even the swirls up here on the pommel, there are swirls and they are in the right place, but they're not exactly the same as the Langeid sword. So this isn't a one-to-one replica, but it is very much heavily inspired by the original. And the decoration isn't exactly the same either. This is more sort of impressed in, whereas on the original Langeid sword, it's actually a bit like Indian koftgari. It's laid on as plate and hammered in. So it's the way it's made and the way it's applied and the final look is not exactly the same, but it's a good impression of it, I would say. Now, one statement I want to make about the grip is when Windlass, so there are other replicas out there that have overly long grips. Now, I have complained about overly long grips on Viking era swords in many of my past videos. The reason being that it gives you a completely wrong impression of Viking era swords. Not only does it look wrong, and I grab an earlier prototype, not only does it look wrong having an overly long grip, just completely different proportions, but it feels completely wrong and doesn't work like a Viking era sword. The fact is, Viking era swords have fairly short grips. So I was the one who was instrumental in telling them, no, you've got to match the same length of grip as the original. Otherwise, you're not making anything even like a Viking era sword, are you? So they shortened the grip to being pretty, I think, the same. I think I dug up the measurement from somewhere, and they have matched that to the original. So the proportions of the guard, the pommel and the grip are, if not exactly correct, they're pretty damn close, okay? So when you hold this in your hand, this does feel pretty similar to how the Langeid, in terms of size and weight and the shape of the handle and everything else, is pretty much similar to the Langeid sword. A couple of important things to note about the grip on this version shown here, bear in mind this is a prototype, not the final one, is that on the final one, these cast ferrules at top and bottom of the grip have actually been replaced with twist wire, somewhat like Turk's head, twisted wire, silver wire, at top and bottom like the original. So that was something I pointed out that really needed to be changed. So on the final production version, this looks a little bit different. And also the grip is a little bit more slender on the final version than on this prototype here. I would also say there's a this is really nitpicking now, very slight difference in the end of the quillons here. On the original is slightly flatter instead of quite as narrow as that. But conversely, the edge of the pommel on here is slightly thicker than on the original. So there's some slight differences, and that's why I think it's really important to say that this Langeid sword from Windlass, I think, is probably the closest replica that you will get mass-produced right now. But just like with anything, it could be improved. And so, you know, like I say, I didn't work on this sword with Windlass. I only gave them some general advice and pointers. I would personally, in the future, perhaps make a few small changes, but it's pretty close. It's certainly, as I say, I think it's the closest mass-produced replica that you can get right now. It's a good quality sword. It's a very good quality blade, good distal taper. It's well mounted, and when you hold it in your hand, if you put aside all of those little minute details, it basically is pretty close to what the Langeid sword is going to be. So it is essentially like, if you imagine the person that made the Langeid sword, if you imagine they made 5 swords that year, and this was one of the other ones. It wasn't necessarily the Langeid sword in the museum, it was one of the other ones. So it's like a very, very close twin or brother to it. Now I'll just say about the scabbard. So the scabbard is wood cord, leather covered, very nice quality leather, and it has decoration on it, including the hand with crucifix symbol. So they've very much gone with the kind of Christian, I guess, connotations of this, the hand of God and the crucifix, but then with the swirling decorations from the hilt replicated on the leather. And the mounting is fairly typical for a Viking era sort of suspension system. So you have a wooden bridge essentially with the belt that wraps around and goes underneath, and this, I'll just put the sword down for a second, this side goes around the back, this side goes around the front, and then you have 2 slits in here, and you basically loop the belt through. You can also have a type that ties. We have a split end here and it ties. But that is, and you've got this sort of rain guard flap, and that also helps keep the scabbard in, the sword in the scabbard. And so once it's in there, it is, does come out if you shake it, but it's a fairly secure, nice fit, and only moves a tiny bit in the scabbard. But we also have a cast, I think probably silver alloy or pewter perhaps, shape at the end, in a style that's emulated from surviving pieces and art. So a nice package. The Langeid sword, I believe that this is probably, if you're looking for a replica of a late Viking era sword, this is probably one of the closest to a true replica of the Langeid sword that you can get in this price range. Off the shelf, available right now. It's a well-made, well-tested piece with distal taper, good quality steel blade, fully functional. Sharpen it up, it'll cut like a dream. I can't cut with this one because it's not been sharpened yet. But there we go, the Langeid sword from Windlass, link below. Check it out now. And I hope that's been a useful review. Thanks for watching as always. Give us a thumbs up and a subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. And I hope we'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.